And off we go. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us on this beautiful Saturday morning. We're grateful for your time. We are here for a city budget listening session. And again, my name's Emily Larson. I am a staff person for the city and I work in community outreach and engagement. So to get us started, I just want to provide an overview of our agenda for the morning. So first, I'll begin by sharing a little bit about our purpose and how it relates to engagement and decision-making in the budget process. We'll go through some meeting agreements, and then we will hear from Steve Peterson, who's here. He is the co-chair of the Community Budget Advisory Committee. So we'll learn about their work and some of the key decisions that are going to be made over the next few weeks here. We'll have some time for questions, and so that's if you have any questions for clarity for Steve or for Kari, our budget manager who's here, to help understand the situation and the budget scenarios that we'll hear about. So we'll start with questions, and then we'll get into public feedback, and so that is where you'll have the opportunity to share your perspective on the budget scenarios and provide some comments and things for our committee to consider. And then we'll close sharing a little bit about next steps, and that will be it. We'll wrap up by 11:30 this morning. So first, the purpose of our time together this morning really can be contextualized with what we call the IAP2 spectrum of engagement. And what this spectrum shows is when we say we're doing engagement, what does that promise to you as community members, Bloomington residents, and then also who will be making the decisions. And so that can just help you understand how your voice is being used in this process. And so the spectrum, you'll see 5 different areas from inform, which we will be doing today, letting you know what's going on, providing some information, but also consult. And so that's the main area that I want to point out for us today. And what that means is that the Community Budget Advisory Committee is committed to hearing your feedback, keeping you informed, listening and acknowledging your concerns, and then also making sure you know how your input influenced the final decisions that were made. In this process, the best way to see how your feedback was used is actually to tune in to the CVAC meetings. They meet on Wednesday evenings. Their meetings are broadcast live and also can be watched after the fact on YouTube. And then who's going to be making the decisions? So the Community Budget Advisory Committee is finalizing some recommendations for the City Council. And you're going to hear about a draft of those recommendations this morning. And then over the coming weeks, the decisions around where things fall and the final draft of those recommendations will be put together by CVAC and shared with Council in early November. So CVAC can make the final decisions about the scenarios that are presented. And then from there, the City Council will be responsible for the final budget decision that is made. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we go through and hear from you this morning. So a few meeting agreements. We establish agreements at the beginning of most all of our meetings that we do across the city and anytime we're out engaging. The first is I ask that you be respectful this morning. Be honest. So we have the opportunity for public feedback, and honesty is really important. We do have a few members of the Community Budget Advisory Committee here to hear your feedback firsthand, which is great. And then this recording will also be available to those who aren't present to be able to hear what it is that you think about what's going on. So honesty is super important. Also keep in the forefront of your mind that all ideas have good intent and have an open mind. So we're looking to hear from everybody who wants to share. Maybe you're here to listen, but we're hopeful that everyone can keep the assumed good intent in mind as we hear different perspectives. Maybe you don't agree with what somebody is sharing. So everyone's coming from a different point of view, and all point of views are valuable in this process. A couple more administrative agreements. We have a chat box. So if you're familiar with Zoom, you've probably used it before. If you're a little bit newer, it's a little, if you hover your mouse, I think for you it's at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says chat. And I'm going to type just a hello message here in our little chat box that you can see pop up. That chat box is available to you throughout this meeting, and anything submitted in that chat box will be saved in the notes and shared with the Community Budget Advisory Committee. That includes messages that are sent privately, so please keep that in mind. And it's also a good space to ask questions. Maybe you don't want to forget a question you have, and make sure that it's captured for our brief Q&A session. Also, we do have contact information and things to be able to follow up with you if your questions aren't answered. I do ask that you mute your microphone when you aren't speaking. Sometimes maybe you're not aware of some background noise that you might be contributing, and it can be distracting from the conversation. So that's another option, where if you hover your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, there's a little microphone where you can hit mute or unmute. And we will have opportunity for you to unmute and jump in and speak. For the beginning portion here, it's best to mute yourself as we hear about the budget. One thing I also want to point out is that we have meeting hosts. That's myself and Kari Carlson, our budget manager. And we're actually able to mute you, maybe in a case where you're making noise and you're not aware of it. And so we can mute noise that's being disruptive and you might not even notice. So something to keep in mind, especially if you're trying to jump in and you're noticing that people aren't quite hearing you, you might be muted. So those are our meeting agreements. And then I also, before we jump into our presentation, want to share with you how to participate this morning. So I mentioned the comment box or the chat box. So that's where you can submit comments or ask questions and have those incorporated into the notes in the report that's shared back with CBEC. Also, you'll have an opportunity to unmute your microphone and participate in our feedback period. One thing that we're going to start doing this morning, just given the number of participants that we have on the call, is we're going to ask you to limit to 1 minute per person to make sure that we're able to get through people that are here today. You'll be amazed at how much you're able to share in 1 minute. And I'll be monitoring that just with a timer. And really the intent there is to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to jump in and speak if they'd like. On Thursday, we did a session Thursday evening, a 5-second rule. We don't have food for you today, but this is something outside of food to think about. If somebody has wrapped up their thoughts, maybe count to 5 in your head or pause before jumping in, just to make sure there's space for everybody to do that. If we do get through 1 minute per person and we do have some time remaining before we hit 11:30 this morning, I'll just let you know, hey, if you've already shared, but you have some additional comments, you're welcome to do that. But we just ask that you observe that 1 minute time frame to begin. And then outside of those two things that you can do today, we'll be taking feedback for the next few weeks. And so if you're somebody like me, where maybe you think about something you wanted to say after the fact, you can definitely send us your comments via email. If you like to write letters and send them in the mail, you can do that. You can make phone calls, and we'll provide that contact information at the end. And then there's also a survey that's currently live on Let's Talk Bloomington, our digital engagement site. The short link for that is blm.mn/Let's Talk, and it's another opportunity for you to be able to share which budget scenario you think is best, why you think it's best, and any comments about what you might change about some of these scenarios or budget reduction options that are being considered. And so that is how to participate. Like I said, thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing your feedback right here and now in this session, but there's also opportunity over the next few weeks if you have additional comments. So at this time, I'd like to invite Steve Peterson to step up, and he's going to share a budget presentation with us.
Thanks, Emily. Again, my name is Steve Peterson, and I'm one of the 2 co-chairs of the Community Budget Advisory Committee. The other co-chair is former Mayor Neil Peterson. The Community Budget Advisory Committee was created by the City Council earlier this year in the springtime to deal with issues related to the city's 2021 budget. So that's the budget that starts on January 1st of next year and runs for the calendar year. Because of the nature of the budget challenge that the city is facing, the City Council felt it was really important to have a really strong community engagement process to gather information and to get the community's kind of collective input reflected back to the council so they could use that to make a good decision about budget changes for next year. The committee has 9 volunteer members, so we're all volunteers. And we were able to get a really wide range of people, including me and Neil, who are former members of the city council. We were able to get John Locks, who was the longtime police chief, now retired in Bloomington, to be on the committee. We have John Gibbs, who's currently a member of the board of the Three Rivers Park District on there. And if you go on the Budget Advisory Committee site, you'll see that we have a wide variety of people with deep experience, either in nonprofit organizations or in businesses, that really had good perspectives and could come up to speed quickly on the city's budget issue. We met for, it's got to be 40 some hours at this point, collecting information from the various city departments, discussing feedback that we've gotten from people in the community, and developing this preliminary set of recommendations that we're going to talk about today. When the city council gave the committee a charter, the council was very specific in terms of the dates and kind of what they wanted in terms of proposals from the committee, but we received basically no direction on the content of our proposal. So we have, the committee has pretty broad ability to decide pretty much any kind of proposal that it wants to take to bring to the city council. And so we didn't really get a whole lot of guidance on that. That was something that we had to kind of develop on our own. I want to talk just a little bit about the process that we used. So we got a whole bunch of information from different sources, people in the community, from the city staff, information that the committee members brought to the table themselves. We took those items and there ended up being almost 100 different ideas that we considered. And the sources of those ideas were the city staff, the committee, and the community, as I just mentioned. And we used a process to rank those proposals, either for revenue increases, primarily in the form of fees, or in reductions in services. And if you go to the links that were provided in the invitation email, you'll see that there's a spreadsheet that has the almost 100 items listed in that spreadsheet. So after the conversation today, what's really going to happen is we're going to take the input from this meeting, from the meeting that we had on Thursday night. And then we're getting emails from people, we're getting letters from people. I'm getting phone calls. I know other committee members are getting phone calls too from people in the committee who want to talk about, people in the community who want to talk about kind of the city's budget issue. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to fold all of this feedback that we're getting back in and produce a final set of 3 recommendations that will go to the city council. So we'll talk a little bit more about that schedule at the end of the meeting. But big picture, what's going to end up happening is in early November, we're going to take the final result of the committee's work, go to the city council. So here's these 3 proposals that we have for you to pick from. And then it'll be up to the city council to decide what to do with that next. So Emily, if you could go on to the next slide, please. So just at a really high level, and because we want to have this meeting focused primarily on getting feedback, I'm not going to go into it in great depth. But at a big picture, because of the pandemic, taxes that the city gets related to lodging and admissions are down due to the pandemic. And you can see here that in 2019, last year, we generated about $10 million in lodging taxes. And next year, that's expected to be down by about 5 million. So we're only going to get about half of what we expected there. And I should be a little bit more specific here. The lodging taxes, that's taxes on hotel rooms. And admissions taxes are taxes on entry into things like the Great Wolf Water Park, the theme park at the mall, the Sea Life Aquarium, things like that where you buy a ticket for admissions. And we collect these taxes in order to generate benefit from the hospitality industry we have in the city of Bloomington, and effectively to buy down property taxes in the city. So one way of looking at this is that if we hadn't generated that $10 million last year in lodging and admissions taxes, and we had the same level of services, our property taxes would be about $10 million higher. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So one of the questions that people oftentimes have is, what city services are we talking about here? Not every city service is in scope for the conversation that we're having here. And first I'll walk through kind of here and talk just a little bit about the ones that are in scope. And these are ones that are supported by property taxes and hospitality taxes. So the police department, the fire department, community development, which does planning and building inspections, environmental health, the public health department, the property tax support for the motor vehicle office, the engagement folks that are helping out with this call here, the golf courses, the pool, the beach, the ice garden, the arts center, and the community center all receive property tax support. Street maintenance and snow plowing. Engineering, that's a group that does work related to design of new facilities in the city, primarily around street projects. Forestry and dead tree removals, and then finally the city clerk, who handles records in the city, administers the election. So if you've been over to City Hall and voted, like many folks in the community already have, that city clerk's office operates that. And they're the ones who also do the passport services. But city services that are not included in the scope of what the committee's looking at are ones that are paid for through fees that aren't related to kind of property taxes or hospitality taxes. And a good example of those fees, of a service like that that's not in the scope of the committee, is the water and sewer utility that the city operates. So the water, the storm sewer, and the sanitary sewer, those are paid for 100% by fees that are collected on the water bill. And so changes in the hospitality tax don't affect that particular budget. And those budgets are operated on a cost recovery basis. And so those areas really were out of scope for the committee's work. The committee's work is really focused on looking at city services that have property tax and hospitality tax support. Next slide, please. So I said before that the committee was asked by the city council and given a really broad charter to produce 3 options for the city council to consider. So we had to go as a committee and set some constraints on what we ended up creating. So one of the things we talked about is whether we thought that this was a temporary change or whether we ought to be thinking of this as more of a kind of budget baseline, that we ought to be setting a new kind of normal budget for the city. We decided really that our focus is primarily on setting a new budget for the city and to have structural balance. If we look back to the last time that we had a big recession in the hospitality industry, and that was in the period after 9/11, it took, I think, between 3 and 5 years for the hospitality industry to fully recover. So that's not something that we can muddle through for a year and kind of adapt and then things will spring back. So our working plan is that it's going to take 3 to 5 years for kind of things to return back to where they were in 2019. And what that means is that we've got to create a budget that's sustainable and that the city can afford for that period of time. As I mentioned before, our focus is on where we spend property taxes and hospitality tax revenues. So the general fund, which is the city's main operating fund, internal service funds, which are funds like the IT department that are used to charge for services internally. And then finally, some of the enterprise funds, and I talked about them, like the golf courses, the pool, the ice garden, that receive property tax support, are also in scope. The other thing that we decided as a committee is that we would only consider changes that the city could make a decision on its own. And I want to talk about what that rules out, because people oftentimes have questions about, why aren't you considering this? Why aren't you considering that? And many of those proposals, while they're good proposals to consider, are not something that the city can decide on its own and put into place for next year. So the first example is we've had several ideas that I think are worth considering, but require legislation to pass at the legislature. And there's just no way to predict what the legislature is going to do. They've been very focused on pandemic response. Legislation to pass in order to.
Steve, we're having some problem with your audio. I can't hear you.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. So what was the last that you heard from me?
I think just after saying that we can't rely on what the legislator does.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So feel free. If my audio gets that way, feel free to feel free to let me know. Yeah, so we can't depend on anything that requires the legislature to approve something. And also we've had some ideas that I think are worth considering that require negotiations with other parties. So for example, we've had some conversations with about the county and the relations of the county around public health, and around the motor vehicle operation that require a negotiation with the county to occur. And because they can freely decide to participate in that or not, there's no way to guarantee that for next year. So we are producing a list of things that fall into these categories, but they couldn't be considered as solutions for the budget for next year because they're not guaranteed. Next slide, please. Another area that we looked at closely is sources of revenue besides taxes. There's two areas that I want to talk about specifically. First is we did take a pretty close look at fees that the city charges. And the fees fall into two categories. The first set of fees are things like golf rounds that are effectively constrained by marketplace prices. In other words, we're operating a business that competes with other golf courses. And we did identify a couple places where minor changes could be made in fees, but in large part, the committee's feeling was that the fees for the services like golf that the city is putting forward are roughly what they ought to be considering marketplace pressures. There's other kinds of fees and building permits are a good example, that are legally required. In other words, if you add an addition on your house, you're legally required to to go buy a building permit from the city, okay? And there's been a longstanding policy and law in Minnesota that cities can't just charge whatever they want for building permits. Building permits the price of a building permit has to be related to the cost to deliver this service. So there's really no room for the city to go increase prices on those because it would be unfair to people. We're the only place that you can go do that. Raising those prices higher isn't really the right thing to do. We do have one new fee that we are proposing as part of our package, and that is to charge youth athletic organizations for field use. It turns out that in many other cities, youth athletic organizations pay the city for the right to use athletic fields. And so we do institute a new fee that would be charging youth athletic organizations for field use. But that's really the only significant kind of fee-related revenue that we were able to identify. Finally, we did look at other funds to see if there was money that the city had saved that we could responsibly put to work for helping with the budget issue that we have. We did take $1.3 million out of savings and as part of our proposal to help with solving the problem. But there are other monies there, but it wasn't prudent in the committee's opinion to take those monies and use them to solve the budget problem for next year. Finally, there's lots of money in the South Loop development funds, but those funds are restricted by law to use in that area. And the result of that is it would require legislation to get access to that money to fix our budget problem. And as I talked about before, we can't predict what the legislature would do. We also have contracts with developers in that area that control how that money is used. And so that turned out not to be an area that we could get money from. And we just did discuss that extensively as part of the committee's work. So if you move on to the next slide, as we start looking at the kind of changes that we'll end up making, one of the things that we found out about, or that people who hadn't been involved found. I knew it for a long time because I was on the city council and we had discussed this extensively. But the largest expense that the city has is the city staff. And I'll talk about a couple things that are going on right now that the city staff and city management have been doing already to kind of control staff expenses. The city management has been targeting a 0% cost of living increase in wages for 2021. That's baked into the budget that we're putting together today. So that was part of the starting point of the budget. So far, they have negotiated a wage freeze with one of the 5 unions, and their goal is to have that same kind of 0% cost of living increase for 2021 in the remaining union contracts. There's 5 total, so 1 is settled, 4 that are still open, and also do that for the non-union employees at the city. We did have some discussion about pay reductions at the committee level, and we came to the conclusion that was difficult for the committee to do that. the feedback that we got, in particular, we talked to people, and I talked to people offline about this, about how it worked in organizations the size of the city. That sort of process can work well if you have an organization where most of the people do similar jobs, but the city's really the opposite of that. We have a really wide range of job specialties at the city. Another important thing to note is that our issue with hospitality revenues is somewhat unique to Bloomington. Most other cities are not in the position of having had their property taxes be bought down by hospitality revenues for $10 million a year. And so those cities are actually giving raises, and that creates competitive pressure for good employees. The third thing that we talked about is the effect of the pandemic on wages and how it's varying based on the specialty of employee. And that makes some sort of one size fits all approach to adjusting wages a difficult thing. I think the committee would like the staff, the city staff and management, to continue to look at whether pay rates for particular specialties are set accurately. But given the large number of specialties in the city, the existence of the labor contracts and other regulations around how pay works in cities that we have to follow, the committee is really not in a position to do that. It's really up to the staff under the direction of the city council to implement any sort of pay reductions like that. And so the result is that the committee focused on reducing or eliminating services. So I want to go on next and talk a little bit about the scenarios, which is on the next slide. So I mentioned earlier that we're working on 3 scenarios to bring to the city council in early November. We're going to start talking about those in more detail. So there's if we look at what changes, what we had to decide about the scenarios, first thing we looked at is we looked at forecasts around revenues from the hospitality taxes. And we assumed the worst case scenario for the hospitality tax revenues in our model. And then we decided to select 3 property tax scenarios that we would go and build budget reductions to match. And all 3 of these scenarios require budget reductions. There's no scenario that creates a budget increase for the city. And so I just want to walk through these really quick. There's a increase of 5% in the levy, 3% in the levy, or a flat levy. And to talk about what that means in terms of the median valued home, which is the kind of middle priced home of the city. The median is if the price of home where there's just as many more expensive houses as there are less expensive houses of that particular house. So for a median valued home at 5%, that's a $3.40 a month increase in property taxes. So $3.40 times 12, that gets you to roughly $40 a year. And you can see on the screen here the other kind of property tax increases that this would represent. One of the things I do want to point out is that for apartments pay property taxes indirectly, so that's hidden away in your rent. But it's certainly a cost. It's a big cost for landlords. And so we want to make sure that we're also looking at kind of how that causes the taxes allocated to apartments to change as well. And I should mention that because of the way Minnesota's property tax system works, you'll note that in this particular model, or for next year, we're expecting a reduction in what a median valued home would pay in the 0% scenario if it's a house, but there's still an increase in apartments. And that's because of the way state law works around how the property tax levy gets assigned to various properties. And I'm not going to go into depth on that. If you want to have a conversation about that, that's probably like an hour right by itself to talk about the property tax system in Minnesota. So at this point, then we'll go on and we'll talk about our preliminary recommendations. So if you could just move up to, I guess, 2 slides at this point. So these are the information sources that we ended up using to build these 3 scenarios. We met, it's over 40 hours at this point for the committee. We had listening sessions just like these, except before we had the scenarios put together so that we could hear what people valued at the city, whether it was lower taxes or particular services that they liked. We also had listening sessions that were targeted at particular groups in the community, whether it was seniors or underrepresented groups. Many of us received phone calls and emails from people. We got input from the city staff. And then, as I mentioned, we had a really good group of people who had a lot of knowledge about the city. And they use that information as well. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the people impact of the service reductions and eliminations on each scenario. To start with, if you look in the second column where it says 2021 actual, that's the actual number of positions that the city is down from the pre-pandemic period to the current point. And so in the 5% scenario, we would take those 18 positions that we're currently down, we would increase that by about 1 1/8 position for a total reduction for 2021. If you go back to the beginning of the pandemic, for a little bit over 19 positions. And that continues on to the 0% scenario, where you see quite a bit of people impact in the 0% scenario, where there's a total of about 31.5 positions. And just for those folks who aren't familiar with it, there are both full-time and part-time positions in here, and so that's why this particular slide has fractions in it. So I'm going to move on next to the first scenario, and we'll talk about this in detail. And if you're like me and you've got readers, this is probably the time when you crack out the readers, because we're going to have some pretty fine numbers on the screen here for people to look at, but we wanted to make sure that we presented all of the information. So that there's going to be 3 of these slides that look like this, one for the 5%, one for the 3%, and one for the 0%. On the left, what you're seeing are the various city departments and the city department's original budget. So the grand total of that is $86.5 million. I want to point out that the police department is $28 million of that, and public works is $14 million. So if you take those 2 departments and you put them together, that gets you to just a little bit under half of the whole city budget. So in the 5% scenario, I'll talk a little bit in that summary table that you see there that's headed by 5% levy. The reduction column shows the effect of the service changes that we picked. So an example here is in the admin department, we selected as part of our 5% scenario changes that have a net result of reducing spending in that area by $348,000. And so you can see for each of the departments, there's a reduction listed there. One thing I want to point out as we go through there is you'll notice that the fire and the police department have no reductions in the 5% scenario. And that was an intentional decision as a result of the committee's process. We felt that we wanted to try to insulate those departments from impact if we could in the early going. And so that shows the effect of that there. So then in that same 5% levy section, if you see percent of reductions, what this tells you is of all of the reductions, how did they fall on particular departments? And so if you see here, for example, the Parks and Recreation Department has the largest percent of reductions, and in terms of the dollar amount of the reductions. If we look at their percentage of their budget, the admin department receives, in terms of the percentage of the budget, the largest impact, followed by the finance department and then the legal department. So I'll talk quickly about the things that we're talking about changing here in the 5% scenario. And I listed these just kind of in my opinion as to what I thought were the most significant things for folks. So closing the motor vehicle office is at the top of the list. Fee increases at golf courses and for ice rental. A reduction in the number of ice rinks that we operate in neighborhoods next year. Not having lifeguards at the beach, eliminating the playground site, eliminating grants to the cultural arts organizations in the city, not doing any concrete maintenance next year. Concrete maintenance would be like sidewalk and curb maintenance primarily. A reduction in services at Creekside, but keeping it open. We'd had reductions in public health services, less maintenance of ball fields. We'd eliminate all of the discretionary travel by the city. So that would be all eliminated, including travel in the admin area. Then there are other staff reductions that are a little bit smaller in terms of their dollar impact. So this reduction here, just to remind folks, if we make these changes and do the 5% levy increase, that causes a $3.40 a month increase in the median home's property taxes, and the apartment would go up by about $4.35. So moving on to the 3% scenario, one thing you'll note here is in this scenario, we start to have some impact on the fire department and the police department. So the fire department's budget is reduced by about 2.3% in this scenario, and the police department by about 0.4%. This scenario requires reductions of a little bit under $3 million in the budget over what the starting point was on the budget. And the changes that we're doing here includes everything that you saw on that last page, plus additional increases in golf course fees, and the new charge for youth athletic field use that I talked about earlier. The dispatch keep that position unfilled. We'd lay off one of the permit techs in the community development department, and we would go for a year without a director in that department. We'd eliminate the remaining staff presence at Bush Lake Beach during the summer, so there would be no staff at that location. We'd get rid of nearly all of the sidewalk plowing that the city does, get rid of the neighborhood traffic calming program, reduce hours at the Arts Center, and there's other reductions to staff in here as well that are kind of smaller in terms of their dollar impact. So finally, I want to show the third scenario that the committee is working on, and that's the 0% scenario. So this scenario, again, includes everything in the 5%. $4.8 million. This is really the scenario where the impact starts to land on the police department more heavily. And if you remember from that first slide, the police department by itself is probably close to a third of the city's budget. And so there's no way to start making changes at this level without starting to have impact on. Oh, Emily is back. Guessing we had a technology problem here.
Hello, I apologize. I don't know. I just lost you. So
yeah. So if you could reshare that, it'd be great.
One moment, I apologize.
Yeah. So anyway, I was just wrapping up there. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to, Emily, if you could actually go down a little bit to slide number 22. And
can you confirm which slide that is, Steve?
That's the kind of all up 5%, 3%, 0% slide.
Great.
So we're gonna have two select sections where we kind of take input from folks. The first section here is we want to just answer questions at this point. So if folks have questions about what we're proposing, we'd like to go get those questions answered. And then after that, what we're going to do is we're going to switch to gathering folks' feedback. Okay, so we're going to keep this slide up while we talk about both of those things. But first, what I want to do is I want to have us see if folks have any sort of questions about the presentation that we just went through. And so, Emily, if you'll facilitate that, that would be great.
Wonderful. So at this time, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and unmute and share. I will say that I know a few questions were submitted in the chat box, and due to my technical difficulties, I can't see those questions anymore. So it would be good to share them again or go ahead and unmute.
And I'll, if there are questions that folks aren't kind of comfortable answering verbally, but are in the chat, we'll certainly follow up with those afterwards. So don't feel like we're going to ignore those. It's just if you want to have it answered right now. So any questions about the presentation?
Let's see here. Steve, can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Steve. This is Mike Dardis. Question for you. On the 5%, did you feel, that the committee feel that the biggest impact that the property owners could bear for homes would be at that $435 a month level? Why was that kind of a magic number? Was there any reason for that?
So actually, that's a good question. One of the recommendations that the committee considered and has already sent to the city council was what the city council ought to consider for its preliminary levy. And so in the state law, the way that property taxes are set is in September of each year, the city council sets a preliminary levy, and that sets a maximum cap on the amount of property tax revenue that can be generated the following year. The committee, in looking at things, we wanted to have a proposal that was a kind of keep the budget where it is right now in terms of services, and so we sent a levy recommendation of a 6.44% increase as the maximum to the city council, because that would have given us the ability to create a budget scenario that effectively kept services whole. And the city council decided not to adopt that 6.44% number, and they instead adopted a 5% number. And so that's where we're capped at 5% now at this point. Okay. So that's where that number came from.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that.
Other questions? So at work, they've taught us to like allow 10 or 15 seconds worth of dead air here and not just kind of ramble on. So.
Good morning. This is Elise Valderrama. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. I just have a question on why you are only having police reductions in the 0%.
So, I talked about how we had we went through and we did ranked prioritization of the various proposals that we ended up having. And so each of the committee members independently ranked the 90-some options that we had. And this order is the result of that kind of independent ranking by the committee members. If you go and look at the information that we posted in the minutes about how the rankings work, there was strong consensus. In other words, if you look at how the committee members ranked things independently, the committee members were working hard to try to keep the public safety impacts as low as possible. You can tell by how things were ranked in there. So that's where that ended up coming from, was the independent opinions of each of the members on the committee.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm not hearing any more questions. So Emily, if you want to go back one slide and talk about the feedback session, you can certainly go ahead with that and we can start with that part of the meeting.
Awesome, thank you, Steve. So at this point, we'd like to hear your thoughts about what Steve has shared with you and the different budget scenarios that are being considered. So during this time, as a reminder, make sure you're being respectful of each other, be honest with us, assume good intent of all ideas that are shared, and have an open mind. Again, we'll be asking you to keep your comments to 1 minute to start, and then if we have time at the end, there'll certainly be opportunity there if you have additional comments. But just a couple ways to frame what it is that you share. It's helpful to know which budget scenario you prefer and why, and also if you have ideas of what you may change about that scenario. So I'll give you a minute or so here to start framing your thoughts. And as I do that, I'm actually going to open a poll. And this is an anonymous poll, so it won't be attached to you individually at all with the data that's collected. And the purpose of this poll is for us to learn a little bit about you and who is participating in our sessions, so that we have some background information to accompany your thoughts. So what areas of the city are we hearing from? What is your housing status? What's your race or ethnicity? If you're not comfortable answering any of those questions, they're not mandatory, so you don't have to. But it is helpful for us when we are reviewing some of the information that's being collected. So I'll leave this poll open for a few minutes. You can complete it during that time. I'll give you a heads up about when we're going to close it. But your responses are definitely much appreciated in this process. So at this time, if there is an individual who would like to be the brave first person to jump in with your comments, we will go ahead and get started. Also, as a reminder, all comments that are submitted in the chat will be included in the report. So if that is your preference to type and share that way, that works just as well.
Where you were.
Hi, I can jump in.
Hi, Lori.
Hi, I'm Lori Aho. I just kind of looking at this and kind of having followed this throughout the process so far. I think that either the 5% or the 3%, preferably the 5%, would be my preference. I don't think the 0% is really a tenable position to take or a sustainable thing, particularly when you start looking at eliminating things like sidewalk plowing and that sort of thing. That's going to have a huge impact on people with disabilities, seniors, obviously the public safety concerns. I think that there are a lot of challenges that we're going to have kind of in the coming months or so surrounding issues with the police already kind of being a little strapped. And I don't think that that taking those kind of, particularly the overtime hits, does a great deal at the moment.
All right, thank you, Lori. I appreciate it. Also appreciate you putting yourself on video during that time. It's always really nice to see you when you're sharing. So thank you, Lori.
Can I jump in here? This is Larry Lee.
Go ahead, Larry.
My personal position and opinion on this is somewhere between the 3% and the 5% scenario. I really don't think that cutting back to the absolute bone ends up helping the community. And I think that the numbers that the committee has given on the effect on property taxes means that something in that area is affordable for most people. And perhaps Steve could comment. My understanding is for people who have low incomes, there is state assistance for offsetting property tax and property tax increase. So there is a buffer that the state provides if someone is really hammered by unemployment or something else, and the city increases property taxes by a little bit.
Yeah, so there is the property tax refund program, and if I remember right, there's also a kind of circuit breaker around property tax increases that goes into effect. I don't have information on that available at hand to talk about it in depth, but for people on moderate incomes, there's an opportunity to have a substantial percentage of the kind of property tax cost be paid for by the state as opposed to having to pay it directly. And if somebody has a question or wants information about that, feel free to put a post in the group chat and we'll have somebody from the city staff reach out to you with more information on that.
Awesome. I did see Gregory Fontaine. I saw you unmute and try to jump in too. Would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you. Just some context. My wife and I moved to Bloomington in 1982, and our kids graduated, one from Kennedy, one from Jefferson, and we have been on more commissions and boards and volunteer organizations than I can remember at this point. So thank you to all of you for your substantial efforts. And hello to some of you I haven't seen for a while, like Larry Lee. I would strongly recommend the 0% levy increase and further recommend that the $1 million reduction in the police not be pursued. I recognize that it feels like these are steep cuts and they're challenging, but again, by way of comparison, our company cut its budgets by 20% in the March-April timeframe. And so I think what is basic, the $5 million cuts in the budget in Bloomington are just necessary for all of us to be sharing. I guess the other thing I would say is that I think we're in competition also, not just for staff, but for commercial and residential development and new folks. And I think that the critical elements are maintaining a low tax base and also public safety. And I just don't think, I think reducing police expenditures at this time is not taking account of real concerns in the city and a bit tone deaf. And with respect to everybody's hard work here. So I would strongly recommend against that.
Thank you.
I have some thoughts on what to say.
So
but
I don't mean to cut you off, but we have exceeded our minute.
Yes.
So if you have additional comments, you can use the chat box. And also we may have time at the end as well. So thank you for your thoughts.
Emily, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This is Mike Dardis again. The question I guess I have, I wanted to raise the issue on the impact of people in their homes right now, and then through probably a good part of next year, these services that are being reduced, and I support the 5% increase, frankly, because to me, when people are relying upon their home for isolation and protection, anything we do to reduce the impact, whether it's public safety, fire, sidewalk plowing, whatever, makes those people less secure in their homes. And that's why I support maintaining actually the 5% level versus the other reductions. I think they take too much away from the person that is going to be relying upon their home as a primary source of security right now.
All right, thank you, Mike, for your comments. I'd like to point out that Kari added a link to the state's property tax refund program in the chat for those who are interested. And our survey is still open, so I'll leave it open for about another 2 minutes for you to complete, and then I'll let you know when I close it.
Hi, everyone. This is Elise again. I'm going to take some more time to dig through. I did start reading through the more detailed 300-some page budget book, and also talk with my husband so that we can provide some comments in some of your follow-up avenues. I really, as others have said, appreciate this opportunity. I support the 5%, and I would like to see maybe some rearranging of the way things are prioritized. But I feel like, for our household, that level of increase to a cost this year and for the next 3 to 5 years is definitely something that we can afford and would like to support services in Bloomington. We've been fortunate to maintain our employment through this time, and we can afford to contribute to these services and to also support perhaps others that are less fortunate. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elise.
I have a question. I realize I want to give plenty of time for others, but when others are not, when they're done, I have a question I'd like to ask the committee.
Great. Well, thanks, Gregory. I can just put a little note here for myself to circle back with you once we get through some comments.
Perfect.
All right. Other comments? I'm going to close the poll, so thank you for your responses there. And I see a few coming into the chat as well with some specifics about the scenario you support, so that's very helpful. Thank you. All right. Well, Gregory has expressed that he has a question, so go ahead. You can ask and we'll hopefully have an answer for you.
It's Greg, by the way. I was intrigued by two things that you said. You talked about the additional funds in South Loop, and I appreciate that for immediate next year, you can't access those. But you also talked about that you were looking at this from sort of a 3 to 5 year structural balance standpoint. I'm intrigued by possibilities to either reduce expenditures to South Loop and charge those buckets of dollars fees for the services they receive. That's one. So in terms of just your thinking, if you have any response to that. And secondly, just by way of observation, I feel there are other commercial districts that could use some significant support, and South Loop being able to support that more directly would be very helpful. Particularly, we live near Lindale, and that's an area from all through the city that I think is in major need of reinvestment. Any reactions to that?
Yeah, so on the second point, the kind of the ability to move money around between districts is super complicated, because not only is it subject to state law, but the state law has changed over the years, and the rules on that depend a lot on kind of when the district was set up, and whether there's been special legislation modifying the district since then. So that's something where historically the city hasn't had an enormous amount of success on moving money around that way. On your first question, the staff has already been pretty good about charging the kind of South Loop funds for city services that we can shift into those funds. And the city manager and the finance staff, I'm sure, can provide more information on this, but we already do some kind of cost transfers in that direction. I see Jamie just posted in the chat about police services and other related operations. So I think my impression is, to the extent possible, the staff has already identified the ways that we can kind of get money out of there and get it into the general fund to be able to deal with stuff. But it's a good idea to go back and look and see if there's another thing that we've missed there.
And Steve, if I could react, so I'm a land use related attorney, so for 30 plus years, I appreciate that complexities are real and significant. But I would urge that as a matter of focus over the next several years, that become a priority to try to pursue creative ideas and go through the couch for change, because I suspect there are material dollars to be found there. But I do appreciate your response that we've looked there. So, and again, I appreciate your hard work. This has obviously been a lot of work you all put into this as I've looked at the line items. I can't say that enough.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that positive feedback. One thing that's not in the presentation tonight, but that is in some materials that the committee has yet to transmit to the council, is we have a parking lot of ideas that we talked about, but we couldn't act on for this year. And so I believe on the list that I've created, kind of looking at that South Loop district, and in particular, the input that you provided was right at the very top of that list. So, you know, my intent is to continue to press for conversations in that area, because I think you're right. I think there's an opportunity to have conversations there about kind of changing how that works. So,
Thank you.
All right, focusing back in on our budget scenarios, what other comments do you have? We have, you know, heard some pauses. So if you're somebody who maybe had a comment that you didn't get to share the first time, you can certainly do that. But I also encourage others to step into conversation here and share your thoughts.
Hello, this is Linda Lang. Can I speak?
Go ahead, Linda.
I would like to speak in support of the 5% budget levy. I am very concerned that with the long-term ramifications of decisions that would be impossible to unravel, one of those being the closure of Creekside in the 0%. That is a big budget savings and it would be permanent, but I think that would be an irreparable loss to Bloomington, given the large population of people who are basically over 55. Also, with a view to the future, the closing of the motor vehicle department and going over to Edina, you know, maybe you shouldn't be driving when you're 85 query and standing in line in Edina with 40,000 other people is not as much fun. It's not as convenient as driving over to Bloomington. And so that would be a decision that would be very hard to reverse. So I am very much in favor of the 5% levy. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Right. Any other comments? If you'd like to join in verbally, we'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, well, I'm hearing some significant pause here. And so at this time, I'll just do a final call for questions or comments.
Well, I have one more question if there's time. Sorry.
All right, go ahead, Greg.
Thanks. And again, this is very informative. I'm wondering, in connection with the hotels and the county and the increased use of those facilities for homeless shelters, have we explored all opportunities to request additional securities or security force on site provided by them or contributions from them? As a matter of geography, it feels like Bloomington, relative to some of our nearby suburbs, is absorbing more of these costs, and the county helping with that would seem appropriate. Have we explored all of those possibilities for additional dollars from those
I know the city staff has been actively involved in, both from the police department and from other departments, kind of involved in working with the facilities that have moved into hotels temporarily in Bloomington. And I know the council is actively involved in conversations with the county about the hotel acquisition that the county has planned. But I don't know that the committee hasn't been talking about that because that hasn't been brought forward as a budget impact, either positive or negative for the budget. Because I think, to be honest, the county's decision to use their CARES Act money to go buy that hotel started happening after we got pretty far down the road of doing this process. And so I think, probably not in this meeting, but if you're interested, I'm sure that the city manager and the staff can reach back out to you and provide more information on that. It's not something that the committee paid any close attention to because it wasn't really on our radar until the very end here.
And again, I appreciate that you have a limited scope, but I do think you have an outsized opportunity to influence some of the analysis and decision making by the council because, again, of your hard work and your relationships with them. So again, if the county's going to use CARE Act dollars for that, they probably have CARE Act dollars available, and it's give and take. But I would urge our people to negotiate strongly to have them help us absorb some of those costs.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's beyond your.
Yeah, we can certainly reflect that back. I'm waiting on that one to see what the staff and the company does first before I dive too far into that. So
again, understood.
Because and this is one of those things that we spent just on this very narrow question. We spent 40 hours of meetings on this, and we really had to resist because this group is interested in the city and what the city's doing, and we had to resist the temptation to go kind of getting too far off of our kind of track in doing things, or we would have been at 60 or 80 hours worth of conversation. And so a lot of these we're going to kind of make a list and send it off to the council, and then the council will make a decision on what it wants to prioritize for next year.
Again, totally fair. I'm just trying to take advantage of the opportunity. Again, having been on commissions like this and committees and whatnot, I am not resisting, and I am seizing the opportunity.
Yeah. And so we'll, I think that to the extent it looks like that's going to have a big budget impact, we'll certainly put it on the list to talk about for next year.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you everyone for comments and questions. If I'm not hearing anyone jump in the next 10 seconds or so, we'll go ahead and move into closing. There's nothing wrong with ending early on a beautiful day.
That's right. Comments in place.
All right. So moving just into our closing comments here, Steve, do you want to share a little more about next steps?
Sure. So, this shows kind of what the schedule is leading to our report to the city council that I mentioned earlier. So this is the conclusion of the second listening session, the Saturday, October 17th one. But we will also continue to take feedback by email through the community survey that's listed at the link there. And if folks, want to send letters or call, we're certainly accepting that sort of feedback as well. So our final two committee meetings are this coming Wednesday, October 21st, and the following Wednesday on October 28th. Both of those meetings start at 6:30, and they are available to watch over the web on the city's channel. And then Neil and I and other committee members will be going to the city council with our final report in early November. And then it will be up to the city council to make a decision on that. I suspect the city council will kind of continue to collect feedback, may make some changes to that. But given the timeline that we're providing the report to the council, it's difficult for them to make wholesale changes. And so I expect them to make their final decision that will be driven fairly strongly by what the committee ends up recommending in terms of the three options that we have. So we are, actively looking at feedback, and I want to say thank you at this point for your participation in the meeting here. It's really great to get feedback from folks and to hear what people are thinking, so that the citizens committee can go back to the city council and report on what we want to see the city do going forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. So just as a reminder, if you do have additional comments or things you'd like to share after we close today, we have Kari Carlson's contact information on the screen in front of you. She's waving if you can see her. She is here. But you can reach Kari via email or via phone with any additional comments. And Kari's really great at making sure those comments make it to the committee so they can be considered in these decisions. Another great way to participate is with our budget scenario survey that's can be found on the project page for the Community Budget Advisory Committee on Let's Talk Bloomington. So if you type in that short little link, blm.mn/let's talk, you can also participate that way. There's tons of information, budget sheets, spreadsheets, meeting minutes, videos, everything that the committee has been working on for the past few months can be found on their webpage as well. So blm.mn/cbac. And then as Steve mentioned, there's a few meetings coming up here where your comments will be considered. So if you're looking for something to do on a Wednesday evening, there's some great entertainment there for you. Otherwise, you can watch it anytime after the meeting concludes. So thank you. If there are any other staff or committee members here that would like to add any final thoughts, we'll go ahead and close here.
Thanks, Emily. I do just want to say thank you to everybody. Giving your time on a Saturday like this is very generous. These are unique times. I've vowed I'm not using the word unprecedented anymore, and I don't ever want to use that word again in the future. But it is. I think it's really reassuring to us the amount of feedback that we're getting from residents and the business community too. That there's a lot of concern for how we serve the community and how people receive their services and what things they value. So these forums have been really helpful for us, and they couldn't be successful if it weren't for you being willing to give your time. So thank you. We appreciate that.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks so much for being engaged in your community and giving us your feedback on these budget scenarios. We really appreciate it. And like Emily said, my contact information is there, so feel free. If you think of things after this, you can send me an email, you can call me, and I will get that information to the committee.
Wonderful. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and